Thanks everyone for attending. It's an honor to be speaking here for the first time. My first time in Saudi Arabia, so it's been an honor. It's been a lot of fun. I've enjoying it so far, getting to meet a lot of cool people. And so this topic came up when I was the red team lead for a global consumer products company. One of the things that I saw, and sometimes we take for granted what we know and expect others to know, even though there's so many different roles in cybersecurity. A lot of the people in the organization didn't know the difference between the different types of offensive security. There's difference, and we're going to go into those details, but they didn't know the difference between a vulnerability assessment, a penetration test, or adversary emulation or red team. So I created a single slide to show the differences, make the comparisons. And some of the companies I've worked for, startups, I've educated some of the sales engineers about the different types of offensive security because there's some confusion. Some of these products were external attack surface management platforms, and they claimed that they did, it was a pen test, which it wasn't. There wasn't any exploitation or hacking in it, so it's not a pen test. And so, at any rate, I came up with this talk, and so the agenda is going to be offensive security introduction. I'm going to introduce you to offensive security, the different security assessment types, methodologies and standards, as well as security assessment tools. And this is important information because just like in the US, there's a magazine called Consumer Reports. And this is to show you what products are good before you buy them, see reviews, and the better informed consumer you are, the better choices you're going to make purchasing products. And this is the same thing with services. This is the same thing with building out a team of offensive security professionals. The better you understand it, the better job you're going to be building your team. So offensive security involves assessing security of different in-scope assessment types, taking a threat actor perspective. So what are we protecting our networks from? Typically people, will think malicious hackers, nation states, threat actors. So performing a penetration test is taking that threat actor approach and assessing your security. Just doing a simple vulnerability scan is not going to find all the vulnerabilities because what happens if you're able to exploit that vulnerability, gain a foothold in that environment, what can you do from there? Some cases you can gain access to sensitive data from there, doesn't require a lot of high skill, and sometimes we run into open S3 buckets in cloud environments. So you really need to test your security from a threat actor perspective to make sure it's truly secure. Just running a vulnerability scanner is not enough, although it's important to include vulnerability scanning in your vulnerability management program. So there's different types of targets, and this is going to evolve as time goes on. As security evolves, there's more need for other types of pen testing. So some general security targets here are computers, networks, applications, cloud, hardware, transportation, physical security, and people. So these last two items sometimes get missed on penetration tests, but they're very important. You can have the best-in-class EDR systems perfectly tuned to detect anything and prevent attacks, but what happens if someone gets into a data center, gains access to a server that someone's logged into as administrator, or any other level of access? What happens if someone's able to tailgate, get into your office building, gain access to paper files or other important information? So it's very important that you're testing the physical security as well as social engineering. Because with social engineering, someone sends in a malware payload to a phishing email and someone clicks on it, they can gain access to whatever that user has access to. And also when you're looking at these phishing campaigns using the social engineering, that's a good way to test for ransomware. Pen tests are a good way to test for ransomware because these different vulnerabilities are used in ransomware attacks. And so the different offensive security types are vulnerability management, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, pen testing for short, and also red teaming or adversary emulation. So we're going to get into some details about red teaming, that it's not exactly the same thing as pen testing. There's a lot of generalization and confusion that sometimes pen tests get called red teaming, which is actually not. So vulnerability management, so it's important to include vulnerability management in this because protecting your environment from vulnerabilities that can be exploited, we need to do vulnerability scanning, and this is part of your vulnerability management program. So vulnerability management is the cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating system and software vulnerabilities, even hardware vulnerabilities. Vulnerability management is integral to computer security and all your systems security, because you're constantly testing, you're testing for different CVEs, making sure that your patching is going well. One of the good examples I heard of vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management is just making sure that you're properly patching your systems on a regular basis. And so vulnerability management, so the steps included in vulnerability management, as we go through these, you'll be able to see the difference, and we'll do a comparison of these different assessment types. So vulnerability assessment, you're doing the asset discovery and inventory. This is one piece that's sometimes overlooked that we have to keep in mind. If you don't know what you have, you can't secure it, you can't assess the security of it. And environments are dynamic. People are constantly spinning up new servers, new cloud infrastructure, so we need to make sure we're doing asset discovery and inventory to make sure we have all these systems so they can be tested. So you get into the next phase, it's the vulnerability scanning. You're using Nessus, Nexpose, Qualys to test for vulnerabilities, or web application vulnerability scanners. And then comes the vulnerability and remediation. This includes patching. So this is very important. And why this is important, a good example, I did a pen test back when I was working with this particular security company as a consultant. We performed a pen test. There was a 90-day retest included in that. During the vulnerability, during the pen test, we got through that, give the report to the customer. They went through and they remediated all the highs, mediums, and I think there's only a couple lows, maybe informational. But in that 90 days, when we came back to do the retest, someone figured out how to exploit that low-level vulnerability. So if they had waited a year to test again, then it possibly could have been exploited. So you want to make sure you're repeating this. And same thing with your penetration test, too. So vulnerability scanning, these are different software tools for testing the security of networks and applications. And it automates the process of detecting vulnerabilities. At one time, the early days of pen testing, there weren't vulnerability scanners. And people need a way to scale. And now there's so much pen testing that needs to be done, you need to be able to scale. And just kind of in addition to this, with AI, hopefully we'll get tools out that'll help scale even further, because with the skills gap, not be able to get enough people to work on our security teams, we need to be able to scale. And this is what vulnerability scanners have done. They've been able to scale what we're doing, and then once you find the vulnerable systems, you can spend more time on those during the pen test. So vulnerability assessments are similar to vulnerability scanning, but you're also validating those vulnerabilities. Sometimes vulnerability scanners will find false positives, so we want to make sure they're not false positives. And so we're also with these vulnerabilities, we're making sure that in the vulnerability assessments, we're also doing manual detection using other tools, trying different password attacks against that to see if brute forcing would work against those systems. See if it's vulnerable to other things. There's other tools. You can run different vulnerability scanners to detect the vulnerabilities as well. But usually it's a better case to do manual testing. So a combination of vulnerability scanning and manual testing is included in pen testing, in vulnerability assessments. So a major difference between vulnerability assessments and vulnerability scanning is the findings are validated and other tools are used to see if you can find any other vulnerabilities. So pen testing is the next step. So penetration testing is similar to the vulnerability assessment, but what we're doing here is those vulnerabilities that we validated and other vulnerabilities we found using other testing methods, we're going in and doing our vulnerability analysis, see if they're exploitable. So once we do our vulnerability analysis and find the vulnerabilities, we try to exploit those. And so it doesn't end there either. We're doing privilege escalation, see if you can gain higher privilege access to the systems, seeing if you can do lateral movement, and accessing the data, because some cases at a low-level user, you can access things in the S3 bucket or different unprotected storage on-prem or in the cloud. So we need to make sure we do that. Another thing too with that, we're also testing to see the level of access we can get, but that's not the overall goal. A lot of times when we're new as pen testers, we're more focused on domain admin, or getting root of a system when the important part is the data. We need to think of the crown jewels, what's being protected. And we need to look for that as well during our penetration tests. So different penetration testing types. So you have black box, gray box, white box, also referred to as a crystal box or an assumed breach. So with the black box, you're taking more of a threat actor approach. So you're trying to see if you can hack into the system the same way a threat actor or a malicious hacker would get into the system. But a gray box is kind of a combination between the two. With a gray box, you've got to define scope, set IP addresses, domain names that you're testing. It makes it easier for the pen tester to find the targets that need to be tested. But with the black box, you're having to do more reconnaissance, where you're having to do more work to find the items. And this is important too, because you want to see what threat actors can find in your environment. It's good to do the white box testing and gray box testing, but you want to see what threat actors can get to. What kind of OSINT can they find? Information on executives of your company. These are the people that threat actors are going to go after, like through spear phishing attacks. So those need to be tested as well. And some people that are really hardcore hacker mindsets will say that the white box pen testing is cheating, but it's very useful because if an application, someone gets access to an environment or an application, maybe they find credentials, what can they do from there? So a lot of times on networks, EDRs get hard to bypass, so doing an assumed breach type of assessment is helpful. So someone gets credentials to the environment, usually it's a regular level user, and they try to see what they can get access to, if they're able to elevate their privileges. Because in the past, pen testers would come in, if they couldn't gain a foothold in the environment, that was the end of it. With an assumed breach, you give them credentials, but it's best to start out at a black box approach, trying to see if you can break in and then do the assumed breach. And the white box or assumed breach has been more popular in web applications, but as I mentioned, it's becoming more popular within network pen test too. And you want to make sure you're thoroughly testing everything, because if you gain access, even like a lower level user of the application, they may not need access to different account numbers and stuff, so need to limit the information that they can get to and prevent any kind of privilege escalation. So red teaming, this is really where pen testing gets kind of confused. So a better generalization to use when you're talking about red teaming and pen testing is offensive security. So red teaming is the process of using TTPs to emulate real-world threat actors with the goal of training and measuring the effectiveness of the people in the process and the environment. Because with a red teaming operation, you're not only testing the security, you're testing the people and the process. Some good examples and outcomes of a successful red team operation is I've heard of companies that the red team operation was going on. With the red team operation, you're not announcing to the whole company that this is going on. You're usually telling the CISO, maybe some others in a control group, because you don't want to always tip off the blue teamers because they don't want to look bad. This is kind of a report card for how the security team is working. So it's limited to who knows this. So some good reactions from companies is where I heard of a company that they actually called in their IR team, that they had a retainer. So this incident response team come in, but someone talked to the CISO, no, this was a planned event. So that's a good outcome. So one of the best descriptions that I heard was given by the founder of Dallas Hackers Association, and he said the red team tests the blue team, which is a good example of that. And so red teaming is also referred to as adversary emulation, and sometimes it's good to use that term to make sure you're telling the difference between a pen test and a red team operation. And so here's a slide here that was like pretty similar to the one that I created at the company I worked at to tell them the difference. So you can see the assessment comparison types. So with your vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment, and pen testing, you're doing reconnaissance to do that asset inventory to discover all the targets that you're performing a pen test against. And the next step, you're doing vulnerability scanning. But if you notice on the red team or adversary emulation, we're not doing vulnerability scanning. We're trying to be quiet and go undetected. So like a red team operation, you're trying to emulate a real-world threat actor. So, real-world threat actors are not going through trying to find all the vulnerabilities that are exploitable like you would in a pen test. You're going in, find something that would lead to a breach. Maybe one way in. Some of the ways to pick TTPs is look at different TTPs that target your industry, and that can be done using MITRE ATT&CK. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework will show you different APT groups, the TTPs they use, and the industries they attack. So that's a good way to start out with your red team operations, picking those particular type of attacks to run in your environment. So on the first three methods, you're going through doing your vulnerability scanning, and with the vulnerability assessment and pen test, you're also using other tools and manual techniques to find the vulnerabilities. But when you get into the pen test, you're actually doing exploitation. You'll also do exploitation in your red team and adversary emulation. And one of the things we do on the red team side is we leverage social engineering more. This could be part of a penetration test, but a lot of cases, this may be the only way into an environment is through sending a phishing email with malware, seeing if you can get into the environment. And one of the things you want to focus on when mentioning the phishing campaigns, a lot of companies use these applications to run phishing campaigns throughout the year. And this is good for security awareness and training people on what to watch for, but you also need to do regular phishing campaigns because these other tools don't test what happens if someone clicks on malware. So you want to see what happens. Are your endpoint detection preventing these activities? So you're going to use phishing campaigns, different social engineering, and sometimes physical breaches. And this is not only data centers, you may have manufacturing facilities. If you're in the transportation industry, the places where you keep your buses, your vehicles, planes, you want to make sure those are secure. And you look at critical infrastructure, physical pen testing is very important. And so this kind of shows you the difference between the different types of pen testing. And I wanted to also mention again, with a pen test, you're trying to find all the vulnerabilities that can be exploited and exploit those. With the red team, you're trying to do something that's equivalent to a breach. And the thing is, you have to have this pen testing going on. You can't just do the red teaming. If you're just doing red teaming, doing adversary emulation, you're going to miss a lot of vulnerabilities. Maybe your vulnerability scanning is catching that, but you're missing out. So this is something that you need to do together. And as well, red teaming comes in more as your organization matures. After you've had your vulnerability management program running for a while, running pen test reoccurring, looking for vulnerabilities, doing your remediation, getting more mature before you get into investing in red team exercises. And so pen testing methodologies, the PTS standard is one of my favorites. It's been created by several people that are really well known in the industry. Dave Kennedy from Trusted Stack, Chris Nickerson from Layers Consulting, Joseph McCrae, which is a consultant, Carlos Perez from Trusted Sec. And so this is not just based on research or academic, this is consultants doing this for many years, building out this methodology. And this methodology takes you through the steps, but there's also like a page on here for the different technologies to use during the different types of pen testing. They also provide you with questionnaires that ask your customer or your internal IT staff when you're performing these pen tests. And so post-exploitation activities that we do during these engagements are lateral movement, trying to gain access from one system to others, privilege escalation, elevating your privilege from a low-level user to domain admin or root, accessing the data. As mentioned, it doesn't always take domain admin or root to get to this data, so you want to actually access this data, see what sensitive data you can get access to, and also test exfiltrating your data. Threat actors are going to try to get the data out of your environment, so you want to make sure that it's not able to be exfiltrated, and you don't want to use real live data for this. You want to create metadata that looks similar to credit card numbers or private information to use that to test your exfiltration. And so web application pen testing, OWASP is a great resource for the OWASP Top 10. They have the API Top 10, as well as they've added some large learning model stuff for AI. So they're really good at bringing out these projects and different tools, like previously ZAP. It's under a new open source web application security company or organization. But the OWASP Top 10 is a great place. Also, their OWASP testing guide is a good place to learn how to perform pen tests. And so different tools, port and service scanners like Nmap, Masscan, vulnerability scanners like Nessus and Qualys, and then command and control like Cobalt Strike, as well as your exploit frameworks like Metasploit and Core Impact. Core Impact is a commercial tool, and Metasploit framework is like one of the only free tools. And then we have our different vulnerability scanners that are pretty popular and well-known here. Nessus, Qualys, your web application vulnerability scanners like AppScan, and Fortify DAST that used to be previously WebInspect. And so that concludes my presentation. Please feel free to connect with me on social media, and if we have any time for questions, I'm happy to answer those. If not, I'll be happy to meet you outside. So thank you.